Hello everyone, welcome to a session on post-colonial studies, a course offered in the fourth semester of MA English Language and Literature program, Sri Narayana Guru Open University. This session will cover the first block of the course titled Major Themes and Concerns. The first block covers some conceptual and ideological themes and concerns over the term postcolonial studies. What is postcolonialism? As the term itself indicates, postcolonialism is a concept, an academic body of thoughts and philosophical movement in which the colonized nations are trying to write back against their colonizers. In 1989, a phenomenal book was published, The Empire Writes Back, authored by Bill Ashcroft, Griffith, and Tiffin. This book is still considered the first major academic intellectual discussion over the term postcolonialism. The theoretical and conceptual backgrounds are described in detail in this book written and edited by Bill Ashcroft, Griffith, and Tiffin. As we know, the colonialism has made severe impact on colonized nations, including India. What happened during those years of colonization and imperialism was severe, and it had impacted the colonized nations' intellectual and ideological flourishness highly and negatively impacted. But what happened after the post-colonial era? The term post-colonialism, which means after the colonialism, has a temporal span of what we call after the colonization of all nations. So this block is related to the thematic discussions and other concerns related to the post-colonial studies. As the block 1 of the course discusses, the power, identity of post-colonial literature have been detailed in the first block of the unit. So in the first unit, you will have some of the aspects like diaspora, assimilation, hybridity, Orientalism, and other similar themes and theories related to the broad theme of post-colonialism. So the first part of the unit discusses about the term diaspora. The term diaspora is originally derived from the Greek word diaspora, which is translated into English as scatter. So what is this term all about? Imagine a world in which people are migrating exiling, and they are traveling around the world for various purposes, especially for relocation and work job purposes. So in this context, the idea of diaspora, which has originally roots with the ancient historical texts and context, has been widely used these days to discuss the concept of post-colonial thoughts and post-colonial literature. So, the term diaspora typically refers to the dispersion of Jewish communities from their homeland in Palestine and Egypt, a significant event that occurred in the history of human beings. Also, the term diaspora is occasionally or often mentioned in text, in manuscript, in religious texts like Bible and Quran. So there is a history in which the Assyrians and Pharaohs forced the Jewish people to leave their homeland and to settle in their promised land of Israel. So such events and such historical memories are aligned with the term diaspora while we discuss itself in the context of post-colonial studies. So the term is currently employed to encompass a wide array of individuals such as exiles, expatriates, immigrants, and writers who have chosen to reside in other countries after migrating from their homelands. So, as we know, the Europe has underwent a great scientific development and industrial revolutions. So, the process of colonization happened in the world, especially by the European powers. The great empire of United Kingdom and the empires of France were spreading throughout the world, so that many third world or Asian, African, as well as South American nations were ruled under the power of imperial powers. So during the 19th century, the British and French did an extensive colonization campaign. It effectively established the dominance across the various regions of the world. So, currently, the term diaspora encompasses both the physical act of leaving one's homeland and the process of establishing roots in a new society, like the Jewish people did in the historical layers. One of the theoretician of the post-colonial studies, James Clifford, argues that both the experience of displacement and the sense of belonging are fundamental to understanding of diaspora communities. So in a way, diaspora communities are undergoing a wide range of mental and physical concerns with regards to their leaving of motherland and settlement in a new land. So this is the term, this is the concept idealized in the word diaspora. So there is a kind of dislocation in the term when it comes to discussion about diaspora. So in one of the academic paper on post-colonial theory, one of the theoreticians of post-colonialism, Ms. Rajeshwari Sundararajan, acknowledged that diaspora has a profound impact on demographies, cultures, knowledge systems, and politics of post-colonial world. So, the study of diaspora in post-colonial context is crucial in understanding the nuances of post-colonial studies, especially in the background of post-colonial literature. While there are hundreds of people who migrated from their homeland or from their colonized nations to other nations, for example, say like Canada or other European nations. So all of these people writes about their homeland in a tone of memories, rememberies, as well as with a regret of leaving of their homeland and settling in a new land. So diaspora is considered one of the prominent terms of post-colonial studies. Can you imagine a situation in which you are not entertained or not encouraged to speak or to learn your language, your own culture, and your own indigenous aspects of life? So this happened during the colonization. During the colonization, the colonial emperors, the colonial powers, they indulged in establishing schools, cultures, institutions, as well as cultural centers through which they spreaded their own white European culture and living style. So a kind of forbidding indigenous culture as well as traditional education system were prevalent in the colonized nations during the colonization. So this concept is ideologically termed as assimilation when it comes to discussion about post-colonial studies. So what is assimilation? Assimilation pertains to the intricate process by which individuals or collectives with diverse ethnic backgrounds are integrated to the prevailing culture of a given society. Imagine that, suppose that when Europeans or the British powers, they settled in India during the colonization process, they brought many English schools to the Indian hinterlands, and they tried to replace their culture, the Indians' culture, the Indian tradition, the Indian languages, with what they see as the superior white European culture and language. So this has severely affected the traditional Indian notions about education and living culture. So the Indians were forced to entertain and to be assimilated into the Westernist culture, to the Westernist language, to the Westernist way of life, as well as a thought that seriously affected negatively the Indian aspects of culture and tradition. So assimilation is crucial element of colonial and post-colonial history. So several colonial empires attempted to integrate their cultural, political, as well as economic structures in the colonies. So many European colonial powers attempted to assimilate the native populations into European culture. So as we discussed, the assimilation policies banned speaking in the indigenous languages, maintenance of indigenous cultural heritages, and the assertion of traditional lifestyles. So the concept of assimilation is intricately linked with the notion of cultural hegemony, which is one of the greatest remarks by theoretician Antonia Gramsci. So cultural hegemony entails a supremacy of a specific culture or a worldview over others, seemingly like we are better than the others. So when the concept of approaching others as secondary or marginalized, and when you implement or when you try to assimilate your own culture among the others whose tradition, whose lifestyles are entirely different from yours, there happens contradictions and internal conflicts arises. So this had been what happened with the assimilation during the colonization as well as the post-colonial ages of the colonized nations. Next comes appropriation in post-colonial studies. As we discussed in the part of assimilation, appropriation is also highly related to the concept of colonialism as well as the post-colonial impacts. So, appropriation refers to the process by which colonized societies adopt as well as adapt elements of culture of their former colonizers. So when you adopt and adapt the lifestyle, the tradition, the culture of your colonizer, what happens there is a formation of a new way of culture and a new way of tradition and a new way of thought designed by your own with the intervention of colonized elements. So this has what happened in many colonies of the world, like say in the case of India. There happened a new culture in which the English as well as the traditional indigenous Indian cultures were assimilated and they were appropriated to derive and to create a new way of life that helped the Indian colonized people to resist as well as to defend the colonizers' tradition as well as their own powers. So appropriation in political post-colonial studies is a multifaceted and complex phenomenon. So it involves the elements of power dynamics, resistance, and negotiation within the context of colonial and post-colonial societies. So the process of appropriation is not merely a passive adoption of colonizers' culture, but rather a dynamic intervention and an interaction which I referred earlier, through which you can adopt a new style of life, a new style of thought different from your own as well as the colonizers' culture. So furthermore, appropriation is a kind of hybridity as well as syncretism. So it involves a fusion of different colonial elements, like it resulting in a new and dynamic forms of cultural expression. So you express your own indigenous Indian culture in a new way when you are internalized by the British as well as the white European culture and power dynamics. So that happened in the case of post-colonial studies when it comes to the term appropriation. And additionally, the act of appropriation in post-colonial studies is a form of resistance and subversion, which means you are not completely succumbed to the British or the white European or the colonizers' notions of life and culture, but you are resisting them all by adopting into a new way and method of culture, and living style. So, for example, when Salman Rushdie writes in English language, using the colonizers' own language to criticize the flaws and defects of British culture and their living style, as well as their power dynamics. So it is a kind of resistance and writing back against the colonizer using their own language as a weapon. So appropriation in one sense is a rich and a multifaceted process that reflects the complexities of cultural interaction within the context of colonialism and its aftermath. Next comes hybridity. So similar to our discussions on appropriateness, appropriation and assimilation, hybridity is also intricately linked with the term post-colonial studies. What we mean by hybridity? As we discussed in the concepts related to the appropriation, hybridity is also a resultant of colonization. For example, when you try to have a food which is derived from the Western regions, or which is basically Western, and when you try to assimilate it into your Indian traditional cuisine, there happens a kind of new variety of dishes that is not Western and not Indian, but a fusion of the both. That happens when it comes to hybridity in post-colonial studies. So, hybridity is a concept that challenges the notion of purity, fixation of identities, and it recognizes the fluid and complex nature of cultural formations. So, the cultures, traditions are changed and they are formed in a new format and structure with the influence of colonization. So, hybridity is the result of colonized individuals integrating, modifying, and challenging aspects of the colonizer's culture, leading to the creation of new cultural expression that blend influences from both parties. So you have an example of a Caribbean language, Creole languages, which developed as a result of mixing African, European, and indigenous languages during the colonial period. So these languages, which were newly formed as an impact of colonization, as an impact of assimilation into the new format of westernization. So this language provides a new means of communications to the people of Caribbean lands. So similarly in literature as well, the authors like Salman Rushdie and Derek Walcott, they experiments the hybridity of culture, language, and living style of both Western and their indigenous regions to experiment in their works. So through their writings, they explore the ways in which individuals navigate between multiple cultural traditions, grappling with issues of belonging, alienation, and impact of colonial legacies on their sense of the self. So the concept of hybridity is much complicated, but it promises a new format of culture, a new format of living style. For example, say the case of fashion, or say the case of cuisine, or say the case of literature. So everything has been formatted into a new version which is not Western or not colonizers or not even colonized peoples or colonized cultures belonging. So the manifestations of hybridity in language, religion, food, art, music, fashion, and social customs have not only enriched the cultural landscapes, but it also provided a kind of defense, a kind of protest, a kind of resistance to the Westerners' dominant styles of culture and living style. So the phenomenon of hybridity in colonial context is a transformative process which continues to shape, reshape, and impact the lives of millions of people in the colonized nations even now. So the post-colonial studies have been highly affected and be highly impacted by the concept of hybridity in the life of people. Now, we are discussing a different concept related to the post-colonial studies, Orientalism. You might have the thoughts like, why does the West always see East as subordinate, inferior, marginalized, as well as why do they always try to teach the culture and living style to Eastern people, and why do they always try to intervene into the East culture? This is the context in which the 1978 phenomenal book Orientalism was published by the great post-colonial theoretician Edward Said. Edward Said, in his phenomenal book Orientalism, explains why the term Orient, which means East, is always a point of discussion and a preferable choice for the Western academic group and circles. It is because the West has always a mentality that, as Said argues, that West is always better than East in terms of culture, in terms of living style, in terms of education, power dynamics, as well as some various other aspects. So, the West always carry in their mind a kind of a type of task of empowering as well as civilizing the Eastern nations or the Eastern people. So the burden of civilizing the East is always carried through the works, through the power structures, to the power transformation of Western people toward the East. So it is in this context that Said discusses his phenomenal book Orientalism. So usually the countries like America, they typically associate the term Orient with the nations such as Japan and China, while the Western Europeans, including UK, they particularly the British and French powers, they extend this definition of Orient to encompass their former Eastern colonies. So, the European powers as well as the American powers are in a saga of like civilizing, transforming the cultureless or the inferior communities in the hinterlands of South America, in the hinterlands of Asian as well as African continents. So, in his introduction to the Orientalism, Said gives lots of descriptions and some of the striking definitions to the concept Orientalism, out of which I pick out a very prominent one which I feel is very striking. So, Orientalism, as Edward Said defines, is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient, means over the East. So, Said conceptualized that for the Oriental studies to exist as a field of academic inquiry in the 19th century, the West had to build or invent East. So that is why they explored the hinterlands of Asian and African countries, Asian and African regions, and they identified the people, the aboriginal or the indigenous peoples are there as living devoid of any better culture, better language, better way of life, better education. So they kind of tried to make the world believe that they are civilizing, they are teaching the people of these hinterlands the culture which is far better than the culture of these indigenous people. So West had made believe the world that they are trying to fill the bridge, they are trying to fill the hole of many gaps which they found in the civilization, in the culture, in the living style of third world nations, in the living style of Eastern nations, Eastern countries. So, according to Edward Said, Orientalism says more about the West's dominance over the Orient than it does about the Orient itself. So, as the West seized the control of scholarship as well as earlier they had the control over the regions, over the power dynamics, now they had also seized their control over the scholarship and the academic groups, academic discussions. So it also seized the political and economic power of the world. So this is what Edward Said means by the term Orientalism in his book with the same title. The term subaltern is another prominent area of discussion in the vast realm of post-colonial studies. What is meant by subaltern? The theoretician Antonio Gramsci coined the term subaltern to indicate the people the marginalized people or the working class people of Soviet Union who were under the control of ruling elite. So these subaltern classes encompasses the peasants, laborers, as well as voiceless groups who lacked influences in society. So there emerged a group to discuss such subaltern themes under the title Subaltern Studies Group, which sought to further the methodological examination of subaltern issues in South Asian studies, and their efforts led to the word being used in post-colonial studies. So this group, the Subaltern Studies Group, were opposed by another theoretician of post-colonial studies named as Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak. In her phenomenal work, Can Subalterns Speak? Spivak, Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak, notions about the voiceless conditions of marginalized people to raise their concerns, to raise their needs, to raise their inferior conditions among the group, both intellectual as well as political. This powerless state of voiceless, marginalized community in the world is defined by Gayatri Spivak as subaltern. So Spivak, in her phenomenal work Can Subaltern Speak?, in which She highlights the various kinds of subject formations and othering, how some people are made into others, made as others, how some communities are formed as marginalized, how they are restructured as sidelined, how they are becoming mimed without any power, without having any power, without having any representation in both political and academic scenarios. So, in contrast to Edward Said's discussion of Orientalism in his book, here what Gayatri Spivak does in her work regarding the subaltern is exposing the realm of voiceless people's positioning in the world and in which areas they lack voices and how they lack voices and why do they lack voices. So one of the key aspects of a discussion related to the subaltern is that the needs, the voices, the rights, as well as the aspects related to the voiceless peoples, voiceless communities are exposed by the voiced people. So when the voiced people, when the people who has voice, when the people who has power in the world, in many fields, they raise the voice for the voiceless people, for the marginalized people, there also happens a kind of a dispersion, a kind of inequality, a kind of conscious or unconscious hiding of the real causes of the marginalized condition of subaltern people. So, a key aspect of subalternity is the lack of voice, the inability to speak, to be heard in the dominant discourses. So, in this way, in the post-colonial studies, the term subaltern designates those groups who are denied voice and who are denied of representation in the prevailing discourses. So anyway, these groups are now emerging as a powerful group and they are trying their best to exist or to defend and to strike back in the academic discourses against the marginalizations, against the discriminations, inequalities which they are facing throughout the field. So next, what we are going to discuss in this session is some of the implications, some of the additional discourses, and some of the aftermaths related to the term post-colonialism. So, as we discussed it earlier, the colonialism has made several impacts upon the colonies. So, even after the colonies were liberated from the rules, from the chains of colonizers, there existed many forms of colonial influences in the regions, in the countries of colonized people. So these colonized people, even after their liberation, this colonized nation, even after their freedom from the colonial powers, from the emperors, they still continue to face many kinds of inequalities, many forms of injustice, othering, segregation, marginalizations in the forms in the platforms of political, economical, as well as living styles of the people themselves. So, Edward Said's Orientalism, Franz Kafka's, as well as Albert Memmi's contributions to the field of post-colonial studies, although they helped very much to give a notion, to give a striking awareness about the concept of colonialism, about the concept of colonial impacts that happens throughout the world, the haunting of colonialism, as they even say, is still being superficially, peripherally, or unknowingly or unconsciously being carried out throughout the physical as well as intellectual discourses, fields of the third world countries. So the theoreticians like Edward Said, Franz Fanon, and Albert Memmi, they elucidate how race influences the dynamics between colonizers and colonized, demonstrating how individuals under the colonial domination internalize notions of racial inferiority vis-a-vis white Europeans. So, a kind of intellectual colonialization, a kind of racial colonialization, a kind of ethnic colonization, a kind of community colonization have been happening throughout the world, even now, as an impact of physical domination of colonial powers throughout the world. So, segregation, marginalization in the name of race, in the name of color, in the name of community, in the name of language, in the name of culture. So they are all being carried out even now throughout the world, even after colonization. So as a consequence of these colonizations in the world, there happens many discourses related to the aftermaths of decolonization of nations, of many African, Asian, American nations from the hands of emperors. So what do we mean by decolonization? Decolonization is the process in which a nation formerly controlled by another colonial power becomes politically independent. So these situations, when a country, when a nation, when a region become politically independent, there still continues lots of issues in terms of framing a better government policy, a better living policy, a better cultural and lifestyle policy for that colonized nation. So a kind of creating a free association is being carried out through the discourse of colonization. So colonizations took place through the peaceful negotiation, decolonization. These decolonizations which took place through some of the nations, they were decolonized through wars, through struggles, through strikes. Some of them got their independence through peaceful negotiations and non-violence terms and aspects. So all of these nations still faces many impact, many problems in terms of the consequence of colonizations in their nations for centuries. So the process of decolonizations frequently resulted in political turmoil. For example, you can take the case of India, where when the British left India about 60 or 70 years back, the Indian subcontinent were facing a severe issue of dividing the country into two nations, India and Pakistan. So see, the political place, the political games of the British Empire to rule the Indian subcontinent under the policy of divide and rule policy, so in which they segregated, they formed and they continued their governance by segregating the people, by differentiating the people based upon their caste, based upon their religions, say the case of Hindu and Muslims, in the case of India-Pakistan in the case of formation of Pakistan, separated from the Indian subcontinent. So the segregation, as well as many internal conflict, racial conflicts, religious conflict, community-based conflict, language-based conflicts. So all such conflicts existed in India when British left the country during 1947. So similarly, African countries also faced some serious economic issues when the British left their nation. So the British left the nation, the African and Caribbean nations. At that time, the British, the African countries were running devoid of enough supply of food, supply of many materials that they dearly needed for their existence and for their life. So at that times, a kind of internal conflict, a kind of strikes, a kind of revolts, a kind of fragmentations that happened among the African people, which are still continuing to reflect in their political scenario. So colonial powers frequently utilized strategies of divide and rule, which, as I said, were seriously affected in the case of Indian subcontinent. So colonialism suppressed native cultures in many former colonies by enforcing colonial languages and traditions. But by the time they left their nations, their colonies, and when they gave the full power and the full control of their nation to their internal community, the internal groups, the internal powers, the problems of deficit of many material as well as life-related cultural, many life-related materials, many living materials were direly needed for these countries, which they lacked very much. So it should be in this context that we have to discuss the post-colonial studies in the following blocks of this unit, of this material. So as we say that post-colonial studies is a vibrant, still vibrant area of discourse in the academic field. Many theories, many types of talks, many types of writings have been still happening in the academic world, and that has to be aligned, and that has to be termed with the marginalized people's voices and their rights. So one of the types of this writing is Aboriginal writing. So Aboriginal writings represent a vast and varied collection of literary works created by indigenous people from various regions across the globe, such as indigenous Australians, Native Americans, First Nation communities in Canada, and many more. So such writings reflect the unique perspectiveness, the unique tradition, the unique experience that these indigenous culture, indigenous communities try to bring into the literary world. Say for example, Chinua Achebe's revolutionary work, I can say it was a revolutionary work, Things Fall Apart. So what has been narrated by the author in Things Fall Apart, which is a novel concerning about the Aboriginal or the indigenous communities of African land. So what Achebe explains, what Achebe narrates in his work is a kind of revolution, a kind of movement using the English language and writing back against the colonial topics or the British or the European topics, cliche topics of colonial powers. So what was even more striking regarding this novel was this novel won the Nobel Prize in 1980s in literature for its extraordinary narration of the local community of the order in which he lived, for which he used the English language in an Africanized, in an African style. So using the language of your colonial power, of your colonial authority, that is English, to subvert, to defend, to write back against themselves in their own language, with a very common, with a very aboriginal, with a very traditional topic, or with a very traditional theme and plot structure is striking, which is very evident in the case of Chinua Achebe's novel Things Fall Apart. So all of this encompassed, post-colonial studies is a vibrant area of discussion and a very energetic field of academic engagement in the field of scholarly world, which still continues to echo its aspects, to echo its vibrancy throughout the academic field. So that's all about this block. Block number 1, concerns and major themes of post-colonial studies. Thank you.